Hello, you are on the channel The Truths of Life. And let me ask you a question that may bother you more than you'd like. What if the greatest calling of your life was being delayed not because of lack of ability, but because of who you still need to become? Because that's exactly what happened to Moses, a man chosen by God, separated from birth, saved from the waters, raised in the most powerful palace of the time, and yet forgotten for 40 years in the desert. 40 years away from the stage, away from the promise, far from any visible sign that God was still there. The Bible does not soften this weight. It simply shows the brutal contrast between a purposeful beginning and a long period of absolute silence. Moses had everything to act fast. He knew who he was. He knew where he came from. He knew something big was in store for his life. But perhaps that was exactly the problem. Because when he tried to fulfill the purpose with his own hands, everything fell apart. In a single moment, he loses his position, his identity, and his apparent future. The prince becomes a fugitive. The leader becomes an anonymous pastor. The man prepared to free a people starts to take care of sheep that are not his own, in a land that is not his, living a life that seemed to have nothing to do with the original promise. And the hardest thing was not the desert itself, but the silence. No new revelations, no confirmation, no explanation, just equal days, same years, repeated routines as time passed. And maybe this is where this story starts to touch something inside you. Because how many times is faith put to the test just when God seems far away? How many times does waiting hurt more than falling? Moses was not far from God. He was being worked on by God. But this only becomes clear when we look at the whole story. The desert, in the biblical narrative, is never an accident. It is a place of profound transformation, a place where God breaks what the palace has built and builds what the purpose requires. Moses needed to unlearn before he could lead. I needed to lose overconfidence to learn dependence. It needed to be emptied before it could be shipped. And while all this was happening, nothing seemed to be happening. That is why this question continues to echo to this day. Why did God allow Moses to spend 40 years, forgotten in the desert? Was it punishment? Had God given up on him? Or was there something going on in the unseen, something far greater than Moses could perceive at that moment? Because when God works deeply, he almost always starts away from applause, away from haste, and away from easy answers. And this is exactly what we need to understand now. Going back to the moment when all seemed lost, when the man chosen by God became just another one in the middle of nowhere, not knowing that that place of oblivion was, in fact, the beginning of his true formation. And before going deeper into this story, let me ask you something simple, but very important. If this question has already moved you in any way, if this silence of Moses in the desert seems like phases that you yourself have already lived, leave your like now. This helps this video to reach more people who are also waiting for answers from God. Comment below something like I have already felt forgotten or I am living my desert, because writing this is not weakness. It is recognition of the process. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel The Truth of Life, subscribe now. This channel exists to walk with you in these stories that are not only biblical, but deeply human. Now, with that in mind, let's go back to the exact point where everything began to change in Moses' life, when the clash between promise and reality became impossible to ignore. There is a question that runs through this story like a silent blade, a question that does not appear written in the sacred texts, but that echoes in the heart of anyone who has ever waited too long for something that seemed promised. Why did Moses have to spend 40 years forgotten in the wilderness? It is not a distant theological curiosity. It is a real, almost personal nuisance, because Moses was not just any man when he fled into the desert. He had seen miracles. He had felt the weight of a calling. He had already acted out of a deep sense of justice. He was not a beginner in the faith, nor someone oblivious to the pain of his people. On the contrary, Moses carried within him the awareness that he had been born for something greater. And perhaps this is exactly what makes this question so uncomfortable. How can someone chosen by God, separated from birth, prepared in such a specific way, simply disappear from history for whole decades? living in anonymity, far from Egypt, far from the people, far from the promise that seemed so clear at first. As the years passed, Moses woke up every day before the same barren horizon, the same silent mountains, the same immense sky that did not answer his questions. The desert did not offer quick answers, did not bring spectacular signs, did not confirm expectations. It was just silence, routine, and waiting. And this is where the narrative begins to touch something very intimate in us, because this kind of spiritual silence is not foreign to those who truly live the faith. How many times do we feel that God started something in our life, lit a flame, awakened a purpose, and suddenly everything seems to stop? No door opens, no confirmation arrives, no breakthrough happens. Only time passes, days turn into years, and the question begins to grow inside. Did I get it wrong? Have I been hasty? Has God changed his mind? Moses could have asked these same questions while tending sheep that were not even his. Living a simple, almost invisible life, far removed from the grandeur of the palace where he had been raised. The contrast was cruel. Before, he walked between columns. Now he walked among stones. Before, he was instructed in the best schools in Egypt. Now he learned from the wind, silence, and repetition. And it is precisely in this contrast that the question gains even more strength. Why would God allow someone with so much potential to be hidden for so long? Why not use Moses right away? Why let it mature away from everyone's eyes, away from even the main biblical narrative itself? This question is uncomfortable because it reveals something that we often avoid facing. God's call is not always accompanied by haste. The promise does not always mean immediate use. Sometimes the gap between what God reveals and what he accomplishes is long, quiet, and profoundly transformative. But at that time, Moses did not have this complete vision. He only had the now of a man who once tried to act on his own and failed, the now of someone who carried guilt, fear, frustration, and maybe even shame from his own past. The desert was not just a physical place. It was a state of the soul, a place where old certainties begin to crumble and new questions arise unanswered. And this is where the story stops being just about Moses and begins to blend with ours. Because the desert does not choose an era, nor a character. He appears in the lives of those who love God, of those who try to do the right thing, of those who believe that they have been called to something greater. The silence of 40 years is not only biblical information, it is an invitation to reflection, an uncomfortable mirror that makes us wonder if the waiting time we live today is also part of something bigger that we still can't see. Maybe you're right at that point now, looking back and thinking that you should be farther away, more used, more advanced, while God seems too distant and quiet. This question keeps echoing because it has not yet been answered, and what follows begins to reveal that God's silence is never empty, just too deep to be understood immediately. If this reflection spoke to you, write a simple word in the comments, something like desert or wait, just to mark that you are inside this story with us. When we go a little further into this story, we realize that Moses' time of forgetfulness in the desert becomes even more intriguing when we remember where it all began. Because Moses does not appear in the biblical narrative as an ordinary person who, by chance, ended up being used by God. From birth, his life already carried clear signs of something extraordinary. He was born in one of the darkest periods in Israel's history, when the people lived under oppression, slavery, and constant fear. A time when death decrees were signed against babies, when the future seemed to have been ripped away before it even began. And yet, the story of Moses begins with preservation, divine intervention, at God, one on who reads carefully. While other Hebrew babies were condemned, Moses was hidden. While the cry of many children was silenced, his was preserved. A simple basket, a dangerous river, a desperate mother, and a decision that mixed faith and risk. Nothing there seemed safe, but everything was loaded with purpose. Moses not only survived, he was placed exactly where he was supposed to be. Raised inside the Pharaoh's palace, educated with the best Egypt could offer, trained in leadership, strategy, writing, politics, and culture. He grew up listening to two stories at the same time. On the one hand, the identity of a prince. On the other, the silent awareness that he did not totally belong to that place. From an early age, Moses lived this internal tension between who he seemed to be and who he knew he was real. This is important because it shows that God does not improvise callings. Moses' formation began long before the wilderness. Every detail of childhood, every access to knowledge, every privilege of the palace had a purpose that was not yet fully revealed. Moses was prepared to talk to kings before he even knew that he would one day confront Pharaoh. He was trained to lead before he even understood that he would lead an entire people through the desert. Everything seemed to point to greatness, rapid advancement, immediate fulfillment of the promise. And perhaps this is exactly what makes the 40 years of oblivion even more difficult to understand. Because when someone is born with such clear signs of calling, the natural expectation is that the use will come early. May the mission begin soon. Let the story move fast. But that is not what happened. Instead of a continuous rise, there was a rupture, a mistake, an escape, a radical change of scenery. Man, created for palaces, began to live among tents. The future liberator began to take care of sheep. The chosen one became invisible, and this generates a silent question that runs through the entire narrative. If God had already separated Moses from birth, why allow everything to seem to go wrong along the way? This tension speaks directly to those who watch, because many recognize themselves in it. People who feel that they were born with something different, who from an early age carry a sense of purpose, a spiritual restlessness, a desire to do more, to go beyond. People who had access to opportunities, gifts, capacities, big dreams, and yet, at some point in the journey, everything seems to stop. Life takes an unexpected turn. Mistakes happen, choices have consequences. And what seemed so clear at first is distant. The feeling arises that the story has gone off script, that the promise was interrupted, that the call may have been just an illusion. But the Bible does not present Moses' birth as a pretty coincidence. She presents as a sign, a reminder that God was present from the beginning, even when the scenario was hostile. The problem is that we, like Moses, often confuse preparation with execution. We think that because something started early, it also needs to be fulfilled early. And when this does not happen, the heart goes into conflict. God's silence begins to bother us, even more when we remember everything that has already been lived, learned, and felt. Because the desert does not erase the past, it makes it even more present in the memory. And as Moses walked every day looking at the same horizon, perhaps he also remembered who he was, who he could have been. Everything that seemed to make sense before the escape. The contrast between the birth marked by miracles and the current life marked by anonymity created an internal weight that was difficult to carry. It is at this point that the story begins to reveal that the problem was never the call, but the way it needed to be shaped. And this molding does not happen in the palace. It happens far from the applause, away from the rush, far from human expectations. What follows begins to show that God not only prepares from birth, but also deconstructs with intention. And it is precisely in this process that something profound begins to change within Moses, something that only the desert could reveal. At some point in this history, everything that seemed to be carefully aligned suffers a deep shake-up, because growing up in the palace, receiving a privileged education, and carrying an inner sense of purpose was not enough to stop Moses from making a mistake that would completely change the course of his life. The Bible describes this moment in a direct, almost dry way, but the emotional impact behind it is enormous. Moses sees an Egyptian mistreating a Hebrew, someone of his own people, and something breaks inside him. It's not just indignation, it's identity, it's belonging. It is the awareness, finally awakening, that he is not just an Egyptian prince watching injustices from a distance. He is a Hebrew. He is part of that pain. The problem is that Moses tries to resolve a spiritual issue with an impulsive human reaction. He acts in the heat of the moment, driven by anger, a sense of justice, and perhaps even the conviction that he was ready to be the deliverer. He kills the Egyptian. And there, in a few seconds, everything changes. What seemed like an isolated act quickly turns into a breaking point. Moses looks to the sides, tries to hide the body, tries to bury the mistake, as if it were possible to erase the consequences of what was done. But mistakes like this are never buried for long. The next day, when he tries to intervene again, this time between two Hebrews, he is faced with a question that crosses his soul: who has set you as leader and judge over us? This phrase is more than a provocation. It exposes something that Moses had not yet understood. The call is not validated alone. It is not born only from internal feeling or righteous indignation. There is a time, a process, and a divine authorization that Moses did not yet have. That moment he discovers that he is not recognized either by Egypt or by the people themselves. For Egypt, he becomes a criminal. For the Hebrews, someone who got ahead of himself, someone who tried to take on a role before his time. The shock is brutal. Moses realizes that what he did was not seen as liberation, but as a threat, not as leadership, but as violence. This is one of the most human points of the biblical narrative, because it reveals something that many feel, but few admit: the desire to do the right thing the wrong way, the rush to fulfill a purpose without waiting for God's timing, the attempt to force a promise with one's own hands. Moses did not err because of lack of compassion. He erred because of overconfidence in himself. He believed that his position, his strength, and his moral conscience were sufficient. And when the mistake comes to light, fear takes over. Fear of punishment, fear of death, fear of losing everything. And for the first time, Moses runs away, not only of the Pharaoh, but of himself, of his own history, of the identity he was trying to assume. Moses' escape is not only geographical, it is internal. He leaves behind the palace, the privileges, the possibility of status, and enters a totally different path than he imagined. A path where no one knows him, where no one expects anything from him, where he doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. But this distancing does not erase the mistake. On the contrary, error comes to accompany him like a silent shadow, because when we make a mistake in something related to our calling, the pain is different. It's not just regret, it's spiritual confusion. It is the feeling of having spoiled something that God was building. It is the question that begins to echo inside: have I gone too far? Did I miss my chance? Can God still use me after this? This moment marks the beginning of a heavy silence. God does not appear to explain anything. There is no immediate correction, not a word of consolation, only consequences. Just a change of scenery, just the weight of knowing that an impulsive decision redefined the entire trajectory. And it is precisely there that the real conflict of the story begins. Because the error did not cancel the call, but completely changed the way it would be handled. Moses doesn't know it yet, but that rash act was the trigger that took him out of the palace and pushed him to the place where God would actually begin to work in him, not outwardly, but deeply, shaping character, breaking expectations, and silencing the ego. And this process only becomes possible when everything that supported your previous identity is left behind, making room for a type of learning that is only born when haste dies and silence begins to speak. The transition from the palace to the desert does not happen with trumpets, nor with clear warnings. It happens in silence, laden with loss, confusion, and a deep sense of fall. Moses is not expelled with handcuffs. He is not publicly humiliated in front of the crowds. But he loses something even heavier: the place where his identity was built. The palace represented security, recognition, structure, routine, visible purpose. The desert, on the other hand, represents anonymity, instability, and uncertainty. It is in this brutal contrast that the silent fall of Moses begins to reveal itself. Imagine the psychological impact of this displacement. A man who grew up surrounded by servants now walks alone. Someone who had access to power now runs away from it. Moses does not only lose the title of prince, he loses the narrative he told himself about who he was. In the Palace, he was someone in the making, someone who could change the world. In the desert, he becomes just another foreigner, Someone trying to survive. Someone with no name, no recognized past, and no clear future. This is one of the deepest pains of the spiritual process. When God allows what sustained our identity to be removed, not aggressively, but gradually and silently. The desert is not just a physical place. It is an inner state. It is the space where external voices are silenced and only what the person really is left. For Moses, the desert begins as an escape, but quickly turns into emotional exile. Every step away from Egypt is also a step away from the version of himself that he believed himself to be. There is no more applause. There are no more external expectations. There is no more sense of grandeur. Just silence, heat, sand, and time, a lot of chimi. And time, in the desert, does not pass quickly, drags on. He confronts. It forces the person to think. In this scenario, Moses has to deal with something that never had a place in the palace, his own fragility. In Egypt, he was strong, educated, respected. In the desert, he is vulnerable, dependent, lost. And this vulnerability is slowly beginning to break down what power had inflated, because in the palace, Moses learned to lead. In the desert, he begins to learn to obey. In the desert, he learns to listen. The silence that surrounds him is not empty. It is pedagogical. He exposes thoughts that were previously drowned out by the noise of palace life. There is also a silent pain that accompanies this fall, the feeling of waste. How many times Moses must have wondered if all the knowledge acquired in Egypt was now of no use, if the years of preparation, study, and influence were in vain. The desert does that to people. It makes it seem that everything that was experienced before has lost value. And it is exactly at this point that many give up internally, because when we don't see immediate use in the past, we start to think that God got the script wrong. But what Moses still does not understand is that the desert does not erase the palace. It resignifies. The silent fall is not explicit punishment, but deep repositioning. God doesn't need to say anything at this moment, because the environment is already speaking. Each dawn in the desert communicates a harsh truth. Moses no longer controls the pace of his own story. He no longer decides when to act, when to move forward, or when to be seen. Everything now depends on daily survival. Water, shelter, rest. Simple things, basic stuff, things that reduce the ego and increase spiritual sensitivity. The man who tried to liberate a people with force now learns to take care of himself in silence. And perhaps the hardest aspect of this fall is realizing that no one is looking for it. The world goes on. Egypt continues. The Hebrews remain slaves. Time passes without Moses making any difference. This seeming forgetfulness hurts more than persecution, because being attacked still confirms importance. Being ignored generates emptiness. And it is in this void that something begins to be built slowly, without spotlights, without haste, without human validation. The desert does not exalt. He hides it. It slows down. It dismantles expectations. It sets the stage for something that cannot yet be revealed. Moses doesn't know it yet. But this silent fall is the beginning of a process deeper than anything the palace could offer. The man is being emptied before he is sent. Identity is being stripped bare before it is redefined. And while all seems lost, while silence seems abandoned, something begins to move behind the scenes of history, preparing Moses for a kind of call that is born not of strength but of surrender, not of haste but of waiting. The desert is not just a physical space, with sand, scorching sun, and cold nights that seem to pierce the bones. It is a space of oblivion. For Moses, every step away from Egypt is not just an escape. It is a silent erasure, a deconstruction of his previous identity. Imagine yourself taken away from everything you know, from everything that validates who you think you are, and left in a place where no one remembers you, no one waits for you, and where time seems to drag on with no visible purpose. This is exactly how the desert shapes those whom God chooses. It does not destroy to punish, but to prepare. And forgetfulness is one of the most powerful tools in this process. Forgetting the desert does not happen all at once. It is gradual. At first, Moses must have felt anger, indignation, perhaps even despair. Why would he, someone created for greatness, trained for leadership, worthy of influence and position, be left in this place without recognition? Why did the whole preparation of the palace now seem useless? Each day that passed, the desert became a silent master, teaching through the absence of applause, the absence of visible results, the absence of any human recognition. The oblivion of the world was, in fact, an opportunity for Moses to find the remembrance of himself, a chance to discover who he was when no one was looking, when there was no crowd to applaud his deeds or judgments to fear. In this emptiness of forgetfulness, the deepest human emotions come to the surface. Loneliness imposes reflection. Silence forces listening. Isolation brings to the surface the doubts, fears, uncertainties that were previously hidden under the glare of the palace, under the routine of studies and public recognition. And it is at this point that the wilderness begins to reveal its spiritual purpose. It shows what really remains when the world recedes, when distractions disappear, when all outward expectation is removed. Moses sees himself before himself, and this is an experience that no luxury, no power, no status could ever provide. The desert also acts as a mirror. In it, Moses sees reflected his limitations, his flaws, his humanity. He realizes that no matter how prepared he was in the palace, his strength came not only from knowledge or skill, but from dependence on God, something he had not yet fully learned. Each day forgotten in the desert is therefore a day of silent training, where patience, faith, and humility are cultivated. Forgetting, which at first seemed cruel, turns out to be a gift, a safe space to grow without external pressures, without comparisons, without distractions that divert attention from what really matters. And it is not only the absence of human recognition that turns the desert into a place of oblivion. Is also chimi. It stretches slowly, almost painfully, testing Moses' endurance. Each day mixes with the other. Each season passes without the outside world noticing. In the slow pace of the desert, all that is urgent dissolves, and that which is eternal begins to emerge. The trivial concerns of the past, the ambitions for power and fame, the comparisons with others, all of these lose strength. The desert forces us to redefine priorities, to recalibrate the vision of purpose and meaning. Finally, the desert as a place of oblivion is, paradoxically, a place of encounter. Moses may be forgotten by the world, but he is being found by God. Every stone, every starry night, every gust of wind, every deep silence acts as a teacher, shaping faith, strengthening hope, and deepening spiritual understanding. Human oblivion becomes the stage for divine remembrance, and the desert turns into a sacred space, even when all seems lost and meaningless. It is in this barren and silent place that Moses begins to be formed for something greater than he himself could imagine. Imagine spending 40 whole years without signs, without miracles, without any visible response from heaven. For Moses, these years in the wilderness were not only long, they were a test of faith in its purest and quietest form. Each morning brought the same inclement sun, each night the same biting cold. There was no audience, there was no applause, there was no confirmation that your efforts, your prayers, or your heart really mattered. It is in this absolute silence that the true proof of trusting God is revealed. Does faith survive when there are no answers? When miracles do not manifest themselves? When the world seems to have forgotten you? What makes these 40 years even more challenging is that Moses already knew the power of God. He grew up seeing wonders in Egypt, witnessed signs that changed the course of nations, felt the weight of fate in his hands even before entering the desert. But now, far from all glory and expectation, each day seemed identical to the last. There were no supernatural signs to guide him. There was not an audible voice from heaven to comfort him. All that remained was the barren routine of the desert, the loneliness that weighed on the soul, and the need to keep the flame of hope burning without any outward evidence that it would be rewarded. This absence of signs is what makes the story of Moses so powerful and so human. It is easy to believe in God when things are going well, when miracles happen before our eyes. But true faith is forged just when everything you see, hear, and feel seems to scream the opposite. It is easy to walk with confidence when there is evidence, but Moses' greatness comes the moment he chooses to continue day after day, trusting in a God who does not give immediate answers, in a plan that does not fully reveal itself. Every step in the desert is therefore a silent act of courage, a testimony of a faith that does not depend on visible signs or human confirmations. And it is not only the absence of miracles that shapes Moses, but also the almost monotonous routine of desert life. Daily survival requires discipline, resilience, and patience. Each morning, finding food and water, caring for animals, braving heat and cold, these seemingly simple tasks become tests of character. Opportunities for Moses to develop an active, practical faith that is not based on spectacles or immediate rewards. He learns to depend on God not in extraordinary moments, but in the small battles of everyday life, when no one watches, when nothing seems to be at stake. And even in this silence of 40 years, something invisible happens. God works in a discreet way, shaping Moses' heart, strengthening his perseverance, cultivating his patience, and preparing him for the mission that is yet to come. The absence of signs is, in fact, a space for trust to become intimate and deep, so that faith becomes something unbreakable. Moses learns that God's presence is not always announced with thunder or lights, but often with stillness, persistence, and a quiet conviction that is only formed through prolonged waiting. And it is precisely this waiting that makes perfect sense in the desert. Silence is not abandonment. It is preparation. Forgetfulness, isolation, and lack of answers are not punishments, but tools for transformation. Each day without signs, each unanswered prayer, each step into the void, sculpts Moses' character, making him capable of leading an entire people, facing enemies and fulfilling God's promise with courage, wisdom, and solid faith. The call is not dead. He was treated. This is one of the most difficult truths to accept when we look at Moses' life in the wilderness, because, to human eyes, everything indicated that the purpose was over. 40 years had passed, and that man who had once lived in the palace, who had felt in his heart the desire to free his people, now seemed only an anonymous shepherd tending sheep in a forgotten land. But what few realize is that God wasn't erasing Moses' call. He was healing, adjusting, and maturing that calling, that which was born with too much strength, too much impulsivity, and too much self-confidence needed to be dealt with before it could be used. At first, Moses believed he knew how to fulfill his purpose. He had passion, a sense of justice, and even courage, but it was all mixed with haste, anger, and the illusion of control. The desert, then, was not a punishment, but a process. There, God begins to work where no one sees, dismantling wrong expectations, breaking the need for recognition, and teaching Moses to listen before acting. The call was still alive, but now it was being polished away from the applause, away from human validation, away from the image he had created of himself. There is something profoundly transformative about this kind of waiting. When the call doesn't manifest, when there are no opportunities, when no one recognizes your potential, you're forced to confront the hardest question of all. Who are you when you're not living what you believe you've been called to do? Moses had to answer this every day in the wilderness. He learned that his identity was not in his position, mission, or status, but in his relationship with God. The call ceased to be a personal ambition and began to become an obedient response to something greater than himself. It is at this point that the treatment of the call really happens. God teaches Moses to exchange strength for meekness, impulsiveness for patience, pride for dependence. Each sheep cared for, each path repeated, each day seemingly the same, was forming a different leader from the one who came out of Egypt. A leader who would not step on sacred territory thinking he already knew everything, but who would take off his sandals, recognizing that he was facing something holy. The call did not die because it never depended on Moses' haste. He depended on God's timing. And perhaps the most powerful thing is to realize that Moses was unaware of this treatment while it was happening. He did not wake up thinking that he was being prepared to liberate a people. He was only faithful in the little, constant in the invisible, obedient even without understanding. And that's how God usually works, treating the call in silence, shaping the heart before entrusting great responsibilities. When the time was right, Moses would not need to rely on who God was, because this intimacy had already been built in the place where no one was looking. This moment in history confronts us directly. How many callings seem to be asleep today, not because God has given up, but because they are still being dealt with? How many painful, silent and long processes are not the end, but the necessary care so that the purpose does not destroy us when it finally manifests. The wilderness did not nullify Moses' call. He ensured that when the call was revealed, Moses would be ready to sustain it. And this is exactly where the story starts to move again, because when the treatment ends, God often speaks. And when he speaks, nothing remains the same. The leader who needed to unlearn. This phrase sounds strange, because we almost always think that leadership is about learning more, accumulating knowledge, developing skills, becoming better than before. But in Moses' case, before he could learn anything new, he had to unlearn almost everything he thought he knew. The desert was not only a place of silence and waiting, it was a flipped classroom where God began by removing concepts, certainties, and postures that could not coexist with the kind of leader he was about to raise. Moses left Egypt carrying a mentality of palace, of hierarchy, of imposed power, of quick action. To liberate an entire people, he would need to learn a completely different kind of leadership. In the wilderness, he learned to serve. In Egypt, he was trained to speak with authority. In the desert, he learned to listen. Everything that seemed like an advantage at first: education, status, strength. Influence became a silent obstacle when placed before God's purpose, because the kind of deliverer God wanted could not act on impulse or rely on his own ability. Moses needed to unlearn to trust himself in order to learn to depend on God. Unlearning hurts more than learning. Unlearning takes off. It's uncomfortable, humiliating, and often confusing. In the desert, Moses had to unlearn the idea that leadership is born of position and understand that leadership is born of character. He had to abandon the belief that great changes happen by force and accept that, in the kingdom of God, they begin with obedience. Each year, away from the palace, dismantled a little more of the image he had built of himself as the savior of the people. And that wasn't loss, it was liberation. There is a moment in the process when God begins to empty us, and this scares us, because when we are emptied, we feel that we are regressing, becoming smaller, less capable, less confident. But in fact, God is creating space for a deeper faith, for a more secure leadership, for a mission that does not depend on applause. Moses had to unlearn the hurry, the need to prove something, the expectation of recognition. He had to accept that it would not be he who would deliver Israel with his own hands, but God acting through him. That is why, later, when God finally speaks to Moses, he does not respond with self-confidence, but with insecurity. Who am I to go to Pharaoh? This question is not born of cowardice, but of a heart that has already been broken, treated, and emptied. The Moses of the palace would never ask that question. The Moses of the desert can only do it because he now understands the weight of the mission. He has unlearned how to put himself at the center of history, and only leaders who leave the center can lead people to something bigger than themselves. This process reveals something profound about how God forms leaders. Before entrusting a great mission, he removes the shortcuts. Before surrendering authority, he treats the ego. Before using someone publicly, he works that person in secret. Moses was not late. He was being lined up. And everything he unlearned in the desert would become essential when he was faced with a difficult people, a resistant Pharaoh, and challenges impossible to human eyes. Perhaps you are also at that point in the process where you feel that you are unlearning more than moving forward, where old certainties are falling, plans are being undone, and self-confidence is being replaced by dependency. This is not a setback. It's preparation. God rarely builds something new without first dismantling what no longer serves. And when that emptying ends, something begins to move silently, because the leader who has unlearned everything he needed is now ready to hear a voice that changes destinies. The desert as a school of humility. If the palace taught Moses to see himself above others, the desert did exactly the opposite. It taught him to see himself in the right place. Humility here does not mean thinking less of oneself, but thinking rightly of oneself, far from the titles, privileges, and identity built in Egypt. Moses began to live a simple, almost invisible routine. Tending sheep required no political strength, no eloquent speeches, no public recognition. It required constancy, patience, and attention to detail. And it is in this seemingly irrelevant scenario that God begins to form the heart of a true leader. In the desert, no one applauded Moses. There was no audience. There was no external validation. There were no immediate results to show. Each day seemed the same as the last. And that's exactly where humility is forged. When there are no eyes watching, when there are no visible rewards, when work does not generate status, the heart reveals who we really are. Moses had to learn to be faithful in the anonymous before he could be useful in the extraordinary. The school of God never begins with great responsibilities, but with small obediences repeated day after day. Humility is also born from the recognition of one's limitations. In the palace, Moses was trained to believe that there was always a quick solution, an intelligent response, an efficient plan. In the desert, he learned that not everything is solved by the strength of the arm or by human logic. Often, what remains is to wait, trust, and keep walking. This daily dependence breaks pride silently but deeply. Moses learned that he did not control the weather, the terrain, the dangers, or the future. Everything was out of his reach. And this did not weaken him. It strengthened him from within. There is something powerful about being reduced to the essentials. In the desert, Moses lost excesses, unrealistic expectations, illusion of grandeur, and the impress. What was left was a man who was more attentive, more sensitive, more aware of God's presence in the simple details of life. Humility did not come from a major public fall, but from years of living an ordinary life. God did not humble Moses. He educated him. And this education happens when we understand that the value of our life is not in what we do for others to see, but in who we become when no one is looking. This school of humility also prepares the heart to deal with people. A proud leader imposes himself. A humble leader endures. Moses, who once reacted with violence in the face of injustice, was now learning to deal with frustration without exploding, with limits without despair, with time without revolt. Each lost sheep, each cold night, each tiring day molded in him a patience that would be essential to lead a difficult, complaining, and constantly dissatisfied people. The wilderness not only taught Moses to obey God, but to understand people. Maybe you're also living a phase where everything seems too simple, too small, too far from what you imagined for your life. But that's precisely where humility is being built. God does not waste ordinary seasons. He uses anonymity to heal pride, silence to adjust the heart, and repetition to generate maturity. The humility that is born in the desert is not weak. It is firm because it does not depend on applause or recognition. And when that humility is well rooted, something begins to change. Because God entrusts greater missions to those who no longer need to feel great to fulfill them. The desert, which seemed like a backwardness, reveals itself as the basis of everything that will come next. And it is precisely from this base that an unexpected encounter begins to approach. When God works in the invisible, there is a moment in Moses' life when everything seems to still to make sense. No outward change, no supernatural sign, no audible confirmation that God was still there. Just the desert, the long days, and a routine that pointed nowhere. But it is exactly at this point that something profound begins to happen, not outside, but inside. Because while Moses thought he was just surviving, God was working at levels that human eyes can't see. The invisible is God's favorite place to work. It is there that there is no interference from the ego, haste, or expectation of others. In the wilderness, Moses saw no progress, but God saw process. Each ordinary day was shaping future decisions. Each silence was adjusting the heart to listen. Each apparent delay was aligning human time with divine time. The problem is that we have been taught to value only what is visible, measurable, and immediate. God, however, works with roots before fruits. While nothing seemed to happen, Moses was being intentionally deconstructed. God was erasing memories of greatness manufactured in Egypt and rewriting his identity away from the spotlight. It wasn't punishment, it was preparation. The invisible is not abandonment. Often, it is protection. If Moses had been called earlier, he would have taken with him the pride of the palace. If I had received immediate answers, I would never have learned to trust without guarantees. God was sparing Moses from himself. There is something uncomfortable about the unseen because it requires faith without immediate reward. It demands to continue walking without applause, without confirmation, without evidence. And that's where many give up. But Moses remained, not because he understood the plan, but because he learned to stay even without understanding. This kind of quiet faithfulness builds a deep intimacy with God, a faith that does not depend on constant miracles, but on deep-rooted convictions. The invisible also teaches you to listen in a different way. In the noise of Egypt, Moses was trained to speak, command, decide. In the silence of the desert, he learns to listen. Listen to the wind, the weather, your own heart. God was fine-tuning his spiritual sensitivity, because before Moses could speak to an entire people, he needed to learn to listen to God without distractions. The invisible sharpens perception. It clears away the excess noise that prevents us from recognizing the divine voice when it finally manifests itself. Perhaps the most difficult point of the invisible is to trust that something is, in fact, happening, because there is no evidence. There are no clear signs, just the feeling of being forgotten. But the Bible shows us repeatedly that God does his greatest works away from the stage. Joseph in prison, David in the pasture, Elijah in the cave, and now Moses in the wilderness. The pattern repeats itself because character is not formed in public. It is built when no one is looking. If you are living in a time when everything seems invisible, silent and unanswered, perhaps this is the most decisive period in your history. Not because something great is happening outside, but because something essential is being set inside. God is never absent when he seems silent. He's just working in a dimension that we haven't been able to see yet. The day the silence is broken, after years in which nothing seemed to happen, there is a specific moment when heaven breaks the silence and God decides to speak clearly. In Moses' case, it wasn't at the height of his strength, nor when he felt prepared, much less when he still carried dreams of greatness. The silence broke just when he no longer expected anything, when his life was reduced to the simple, the repetitive, the seemingly irrelevant. This is how God usually acts. Silence doesn't end when we're eager for answers, but when we're mature enough to hear them without distorting them. Moses was not looking for a spiritual experience. He was tending sheep, living another ordinary day, walking along paths he already knew. And that's important, because God's call did not interrupt a moment of glory, but went through a tired routine. The fire appeared, but Moses had been there for a long time. The extraordinary has emerged within the ordinary. The silence broke without warning, without emotional preparation, without progressive signs. It just happened. And when God speaks, there is no doubt that it is him. What draws attention is not only the burning bush, but the timing. Why that day? Why at that specific moment? Because everything that needed to be dealt with had already been dealt with in the invisible. Pride was broken, haste was dissolved, self-confidence gave way to dependence. Silence was not the absence of God, it was a filter. It was only after Moses was emptied of what would prevent him from obeying that the voice finally echoed. God does not speak before because he knows that listening without maturity can be more dangerous than not listening at all. When the silence is broken, it is not accompanied by long explanations. God did not tell Moses everything that would happen in Egypt, nor did he detail each obstacle. nor did he give assurances of ease. He only revealed who he was. I am. That was enough, because when we know who God is, we don't need to understand everything he's going to do. The silence is broken to reveal identity, not to satisfy curiosity. There is something profoundly transformative about this moment. The same man who spent decades without answers now has to deal with a voice that changes everything. Prolonged silence teaches us to value the word when it finally arrives. That is why Moses does not interrupt God, does not argue, does not impose conditions. He approaches with fear. Silence taught him reverence. The desert taught him to recognize that being in the presence of God requires taking off his sandals, that is, abandoning old postures, old certainties, old defenses. The day the silence is broken is also the day when you can no longer pretend that nothing is happening. Moses could have ignored the bush, gone on his way and returned to his routine, but something inside him was already sensitive enough to stop, observe, and get closer. The silence had fine-tuned his spiritual perception. He recognized that this moment was not ordinary, and that's crucial. Many miss God's move not because he does not speak, but because they are not attentive when the silence ends. When God breaks the silence, he does not return the past. It inaugurates a new phase. Moses does not become Prince of Egypt again. He becomes something much bigger, but also much heavier, an instrument in God's hands. The silence was not an interval between two calls. It was the process itself that made the call possible. Maybe you're living right on that threshold. Years of silence, waiting, frustration, and a sense of forgetfulness. And without realizing it, God is about to speak in a way that will change your story. Not because you did something extraordinary, but because you stayed, because he didn't, because you let silence mold you instead of harden you. If this part of the story makes sense to you, comment here a short sentence, almost like a prayer. I am attentive. Sometimes all God expects is a heart willing to stop and listen when the silence finally breaks. The man who came back different. When Moses comes down from that encounter, he does not return to the wilderness as one who has only had an intense spiritual experience. He comes back different inside, no longer the confident prince who believed he knew how to free a people, nor the broken fugitive who had resigned himself to anonymity. The silence, followed by the voice of God, produced a transformed man, and this transformation is not immediately visible to those who look from the outside, but it is profound to those who carry it from the inside. Moses now walks with a new awareness. He knows who God is and, for the first time, understands who he really is. The returning Moses is no longer guided by impulsiveness, but by obedience. Before, he acted on his own. Now, he acts by divine direction. The desert didn't just empty it, it reconfigured it. The prolonged silence removed layers of pride, haste, and self-sufficiency, replacing all of that with fear, listening, and dependence. The man who returns is slower in his words, more careful in his decisions, and much more aware of the weight of the mission he carries. God didn't need someone impressive. I needed someone moldable. It is interesting to note that even after the call, Moses still feels inadequate. He questions, hesitates, points out his limitations. This is not weakness. It is the result of the process. The man who came back different no longer trusts himself as before, and this, paradoxically, makes him much more prepared. Silence taught Moses that capacity without direction breeds disaster, but limitation in God's hands breeds deliverance. He did not lose consciousness of his faults. He lost the illusion that they disqualified him. When Moses returns to the scene of promise, he does not return to occupy a place of honor, but to face resistance, confrontation, and opposition. The man who came back different understands that the call is not a stage. It is a burden. Silence did not deceive him with promises of ease, but strengthened him to endure rejection, frustration, and delay. He knows that obeying God does not always bring immediate applause, but it always produces eternal purpose. There is something very powerful about this inner change. Moses now speaks, less of himself and more of what God said. Their authority comes not from past titles or natural abilities, but from the presence they carry. The man who came back different doesn't need to prove anything to anyone. He just needs to stay true to what he heard when the silence was broken. And this completely changes the way he positions himself before the Pharaoh, the people, and even himself. The desert did not erase the call, but it erased the distortions. Moses does not return to save Israel with his own hands. He returns to be an instrument through which God acts. This is a subtle but decisive difference. Before, he wanted to solve the problem. Now, he trusts that God has already decided to act. Silence taught him not to take the place that belongs only to the Lord. Perhaps this is one of the most difficult parts of the spiritual process. Accepting that silence changes us in a way that we don't always like. It makes us more aware, more cautious, less impulsive. But it also makes us more aligned, more sensitive, and more useful in the kingdom. The man who comes back different carries invisible marks. But these marks are signs of spiritual maturity, and that's why God doesn't call Moses back sooner. If he had returned without going through this process, he would have repeated the same mistakes, only on a larger scale. The silence was not delayed, it was protection. It was God saying, without words, that the time was not yet ripe. Now it is. Now Moses does not return to shine, but to obey. He does not come back to be remembered, but to fulfill what was prepared in secret, the time that seemed lost. It wasn't. When we look back at those 40 years of Moses in the wilderness, the immediate feeling is one of waste. Decades away from the palace, far from the promise, far from any visible sign of progress. To humanize it was to l'enpujisfy. But the truth that only reveals itself at the end of the process is this: none of that time was lost. Each day of anonymity was charged with purpose. Even when Moses could not see, the wilderness was not an interval between two calls. It was the very path of the call. There is something deeply uncomfortable about admitting this, because it means accepting that God works differently from our logic. While Moses thought his story had been cut short, God was writing the most important part of it in the unseen. Time that seemed stagnant was actually accelerating an internal process that could not be rushed. God was not only forming a deliverer, but a man capable of sustaining the weight of the mission without getting lost in it. When Moses returns, we realize that everything he learned in the wilderness now makes sense. The patience to deal with a difficult people, the humility to listen to detailed instructions, the emotional endurance to endure constant rejection, the spiritual sensitivity to discern God's voice in the midst of chaos. None of this is learned in the palace. None of this is born in comfortable environments. What seemed like a delay was, in fact, specific preparation. The time that seemed lost also redefined Moses' priorities. Before, he wanted quick results. Now, he understands long processes. Before, he acted on impulse. Now, he waits for divine direction. The prolonged silence taught something that no public victory could teach: total dependence on God. And this dependence is not weakness. It is the basis of all true spiritual authority. Perhaps the greatest spiritual trap is to believe that we are only moving forward when everything is visible. Moses spent 40 years without seeing anything extraordinary happen, but it was exactly there that the extraordinary was being built. God doesn't waste time, even when it feels like we're off the main script. What seems like a deviation to us is a strategic route to him. The desert was not a mistake in the course. It was a shortcut to maturity. This theme touches deep because many who are listening now also carry this feeling of lost time. Years in silence, closed doors, promises that seem forgotten. The story of Moses directly confronts this pain. It reveals that God does not measure purpose by speed, but by depth. The time that seemed lost was aligning character, healing wounds, adjusting motivations, and preparing the heart for something greater than Moses imagined when it all began. When we finally see Moses before Pharaoh, we understand that this man only exists because of the desert. If we take away the 40 years of silence, we take away the authority, patience, and maturity needed to lead Israel. What seemed like backwardness was, in fact, the foundation of everything that would come after. God didn't just give back time, He multiplied the impact. And perhaps that's the most powerful message of this ending. Heaven is not late in your life. God's clock does not run according to our anxiety. The time that seemed lost may be the most decisive period in its history, even if today everything seems too silent. The wilderness is not the end of the calling. Often, this is exactly where it is purified. What if your desert is the same kind of place? This question does not come to accuse, it comes to awaken. Because when we look at the story of Moses carefully, we realize that the desert was not just a geographical setting, but a deep spiritual state, a space where everything that seemed essential was taken away to reveal what really sustained the faith. And that's exactly how many live today, not in a desert of sand, but in a desert of answers, of signs, of clear direction, a place where prayers seem to be no more than the ceiling and silence weighs more than any words. Perhaps you are living in a time when nothing happens on the outside, and this generates the feeling that God is far away. But what if, as happened with Moses, this apparent distancing is not abandonment, but an approach to another level? The desert is not an automatic punishment, nor a sign of divine rejection. Often, it is the environment chosen to reveal who you are when everything that defined you has been taken away. No applause, no recognition, no control, just you, time and God. The problem is that we have been taught to interpret silence as absence and delay as carelessness. Moses could have concluded that too. 40 years without miracles, without an audible voice, without renewed promises. Still, that same desert was molding in it something that Egypt could never form. And maybe your desert is doing the same now, even if you can't see it yet. God works with depth, not in haste. There is a kind of spiritual maturity that is only born when we are forced to slow down. In the wilderness, Moses learned to wait, to observe, to listen to what he had previously ignored. Silence began to educate his spiritual senses. And that's uncomfortable because it takes away from us the illusion of control. But it is also liberating because it teaches us to depend less on circumstances and more on presence. If your desert looks like repeated days, closed doors, and unanswered questions, maybe it's setting you up for something that requires inner stability. God does not entrust great responsibilities to hearts that are too hasty or wounded. The desert reveals intentions, purifies motivations, and realigns expectations. He does not quench the call, it deepens it. Us with Moses, the time of anonymity may be protecting you from rising too soon, unprepared for the weight of what would come next. It's hard to accept that when the pain is real and the silence feels too long. But biblical history shows a clear pattern. God usually forms in secret what he intends to wear in public. The desert is the place where faith stops, depending on constant signs, and starts to rely on trust. It is not a comfortable place, but it is a safe place when understood through the right prism. Before closing, I want you to bring this whole story into your own life. Moses is not just a distant character in the Bible. He is the portrait of all of us when we enter phases that we do not understand. Times when we do everything right. We have promises. We carry a calling in our hearts. And yet we are led to silence, to waiting, to anonymity. Moses' desert was not only geographical, it was emotional, spiritual, and existential. And perhaps, as you listen to this now, you will realize that you are also experiencing something similar. How many times have you wondered if God still remembers you? Does that old dream still make sense? If the time that is passing is not being wasted? Moses spent decades thinking that his story was over, when in fact it was being profoundly shaped. The desert did not erase who he was. It just removed everything he didn't need to be. And that hurts, because growing up hurts. Waiting hurts. Not understanding hurts. But it is almost always in this uncomfortable place that God works most deeply. Now, the question changes direction and comes straight to you. What if this difficult time you are living is not a sign of abandonment, but of preparation? What if the silence that scares you today is the same one that is strengthening your faith, your maturity, and your dependence on God? Moses could only lead an entire people after learning to tend sheep in silence. Maybe God is teaching you something now that will only make sense later on. The problem is that most people give up in the middle of the process. They confuse waiting with rejection and silence with absence. But God was never absent in the story of Moses. He was just working away from the spotlight. And this confronts us because it forces us to trust even when there are no signs, miracles, or applause. If this message touched you in any way, leave your like. This helps the video reach others who are also traversing quiet deserts. If you identified with this waiting phase, comment below a simple word, "I've come this far." And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel The Truths of Life, subscribe now, because here we talk about real processes, mature faith, and truths that transform.